This is a reading from Saint Lydwine of Schiedam by J.K. Huysmans. Chapter 5. After she'd entered the way of mystic substitution and had, of her own free will, ordered herself as the scapegoat for the sins of the world, Jesus threw his dominion upon her, and she lived that abnormal existence wherein griefs serve as a means of procuring joy. The more she suffered, the more she was satisfied, and the more she wished to suffer. She knew that she was not alone now, that her tortures had but one aim, that they tended to the good of the church, and that they palliated the offenses of the living and the dead. She knew that it was for the glory of God that the perfumed flower bed of her wounds raised both humble and magnificent flowers. She could verify by her own experience the justice of a reply of Saint Félicité to the railleries of an executioner who was jeering at her cries when she lay in prison before being thrown to the wild beasts in the arena. "What will you do when you are being devoured by the beasts?" asked this man. And the saint replied, "It is I who suffer now, but then, when I have been martyred, it will be another who will suffer for me, because I shall suffer for him." It is very difficult to analyze this life, so different from ours, during the greater part of which small tortures and joys were intermingled. Both our exaltations and our pains are indeed moderate and of small account. We live in a temperate climate, in a zone of tepid piety, where vegetation is stunted and nature feeble. Lydwine herself had been uprooted from an inert soil to be transplanted into the ardent soil of mysticism, and the sap, till then torpid, boiled over in the fierce fire of love. She panted, twisted herself, ground her teeth, or lay half dead, and all the time she was in a state of ecstasy. She was always either in one extreme or the other, her intense joy compensating for her intense suffering. She expressed it very simply. "The consolations which I experience are proportionate to the trials I endure, and I find them so exquisite that I would not change them for all the pleasures of man." Nevertheless, the sum of her maladies continued to overwhelm her, and she was attacked by a furious recrudescence of disease. Her stomach finally burst like a ripe fruit, and they had to apply a woolen cushion to press back her entrails and prevent them from leaving the body. Soon, when they wished to move her to change the sheets of her bed, they had to bind her members firmly with napkins and cloths, for otherwise her body would have fallen to pieces and would come away in the hands of those who tended her. By a miracle, evidently intended to certify the superhuman origin of these ills, Lydwine no longer ate food, or scarcely ate any. In 30 years, she only ate as much as a healthy person is accustomed to consume in 3 days. During the first years of her life as a recluse, her only food from morning to night was one round of apple of the thickness of the sacred host, which they toasted for her at the end of a little pair of tongs, and if she occasionally attempted to swallow a mouthful of bread steeped in beer or milk, she was only able to do so with great difficulty. After a time, the slice of apple became too much for her, and she had to content herself with a drop of wine and water, flavored by a dash of spice or a muscade, or by a morsel of date. Next, she sustained herself solely on wine and water, wetting her lips with it rather than drinking it, and absorbing about half a pint in a week. Very often, as spring water was dear in Schiedam, they gave her river water from the Meuse, which was either salt or fresh according to the ebb and flow of the tide, for the Meuse runs into the sea quite near the town. Lydwine preferred to have it drawn for her just at the flow where it was bitter and salt, as she could then herself convert it into a most acceptable drink. When she was reduced to taking only liquid food, sleep, which was already rare, completely forsook her, and the nights were endless, implacable, as she remained motionless on her back, of which the skin was raw. Those attending her reckoned that she had not slept as much as 3 good nights in 30 years. Finally, she ceased to take any food at all, and even the wish to sleep, which was only, according to her biographers, a temptation of the devil, also disappeared. A sort of lethargy indeed overcame her each time she prepared to meditate on the Passion of Christ, and she struggled in vain against this drowsiness. "Give up these exercises and sleep," said Jean Pot to her. "You will come back to them later." She obeyed, and this state of irresistible torpor ceased. This want of nourishment and this perpetual insomnia caused her to be subjected to the most cruel humiliations and base insinuations. All the town talked of the singular case of a young girl who neither ate nor slept, yet remained alive, and the fame of this marvel was widespread. To many, her story seemed impossible. They ignored the numerous facts of this kind recorded in the biographies of saints who were predecessors or contemporaries of Lydwine. Attracted by curiosity, many visited her and explored her house relentlessly, and she had to submit to an inquisitorial inquiry into her life. Her detractors were not four only, as in the case of the friends of Job, they were legion. Most of them saw only a head, riven from forehead to nose, a face furrowed like a melon, a body whose flesh had to be compressed like that of a mummy by the interlacing of bandages, and disgust overcame them at the sight of so many infirmities. Their curiosity was deceived. They had only discovered a Gorgon's mask, where they had expected to find a more or less comely face which would have moved them, or a physiognomy more or less bizarre at which they could have jibed. They only saw the surface. They distinguished no ray of light under the horn panels of this broken lantern set in the shade in a corner, and yet the soul shone through, for Jesus filled it with his love and gilded it with his radiance. They revenged themselves for their disappointments by accusing her of deceit. They said that she did not really observe the diet, that she ate greedily when she was alone, and that she drank at night. They pestered her with questions, prepared pitfalls for her, tried to lead her to contradict herself. To all their interrogations, she answered simply, "I do not understand you. You believe it is impossible to subsist without the help of food, but God is master, I presume, and can act as he wishes. You affirm that my maladies should kill me, but they will not kill me till the Savior wishes it." And she added, for those who tendered hypocritically pity, "I am not to be pitied. I am happy as I am, and if the recitation of a Hail Mary would avail to cure me, I would not recite it." Others went further still and brutally abused her, crying, "Make no mistake, my beauty, we are not duped by you. You pretend to live without nourishment, and you feel secretly you are a pretty cat, and as deceitful as can be." And Lydwine, a little surprised at this violence, asked them what interest she could possibly have in lying like that. Besides, she said, to eat is not a sin, and not to eat is not an act of glory, so far as I know. Embarrassed by the good sense of these replies, they changed their mode of attack and charged her with being possessed. The devil alone was capable of working such magic, and these deceits were the result of a pact with him. Rare indeed were those who believed her to be neither charlatan nor sorceress, but understood that she was in reality a victim ground in the mortar of God, a pitiful emblem of the suffering church. Little by little, however, the truth prevailed. Annoyed at these conflicting accounts, the burgomasters of Schiedam resolved to get at the facts of the case. They subjected Lydwine for months to incessant surveillance and were compelled to recognize that she was a saint whose abnormal existence could only be explained by a particular design from on high, a fact which they promulgated in a legal document sealed with the seal of the city. They met on the 12th of September, 1421, to verify the testimonials concerning Lydwine's life, the privation of all nourishment and of sleep, the state of the body reduced to a heap of shreds, one portion of the entrails amputated, the other teeming with parasites, and yet exhaling a sweet perfume. In short, all the details that we have enumerated. The legal document is inserted at length in the volume of the Bollandists at the head of the Second Life by Brugmann. One ought also to add this fact, stated by all her biographers, that Lydwine's parents preserved in a vessel fragments of bone and strips of flesh which had detached themselves from their child's limbs, and that those remains exhaled a sweet perfume. Some gossips who had heard of this prodigy ran to assure themselves of its veracity, but Lydwine, whom these visits incommoded, implored her mother to bury these poor remains, and to satisfy her, Petronile did so. It seems that after this proclamation of the burgomasters and municipality of Schiedam, Lydwine was left in peace, as her good faith was of public notoriety. 4 years later, however, when Philippe of Burgundy, after having invaded Flanders, left a corps of occupation at Schiedam, the commandant of the place, who was a Frenchman, wished to assure himself that the phenomena attested by the town manifesto were correct. He gave as a pretext his desire to protect the saint from possible outrage, and quartered on her house a troop of 6 soldiers, whom he chose from amongst the most honest and most religious. Then he removed her family, who had to camp in another part of the town, and ordered his subordinates to relieve each other so that they should not lose sight of their prisoner by day or night, and to prevent any food or drink from reaching her. They executed these orders to the letter, inspecting even pots of ointment to be sure that they did not contain any substance that could comfort her. No one except a widow of the name of Catherine was admitted to attend her, and she was searched before she entered the room. They mounted guard thus round her bed for 9 days, and during that time they saw Lydwine a prey to extravagant tortures, dissolved in tears, but smiling, lost in ecstasy, and wrapped as if outside the world in waves of joy. As for herself, it is doubtful if she perceived their presence. God so snatched her away far from her dwelling place, sparing her the irksome spectacle of these men whose eyes never left her. When their duty ceased, they certified shortly that their captive had lived, as they had been told, on air alone, without taking any food. This surveillance, therefore, only went to prove once more Lydwine's honesty and the authenticity of the unusual existence which she underwent. Indeed, this repetition of investigation was very unnecessary. The challenge of a little town always on the watch, the rage for espionage in the province, made the whole affair very public. Lydwine would not have been able to swallow a mouthful of bread without all Schiedam knowing it. But if God willed that these facts should be closely examined into and proved, it was no doubt should remain, and that such graces should not be relegated to the place of mere legend. Indeed, it must be admitted that he constantly acts in this way. Did he not act in the same manner in the 19th century with Catherine Emmerich and Louise Lateau, 2 stigmatized saints whose lives present more than one analogy to that of Lydwine?